Gonzaga has a chance to get back on track on Saturday in Portland against the Pilots. What improvements do we hope to see after a week off?
You are Locked On Zags, your daily podcast on the Gonzaga Bulldogs. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is going on, y'all? Happy Friday and welcome into the Locked On Zags podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I am your host and longtime Gonzaga podcaster, Andy Patton, here to bring you news and updates on all things Zag athletics. Today's episode of Locked On Zags is brought to you by Gametime. Folks, download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCollege, and you'll get $20 off your first purchase. Well, folks, apologies for the delay on the show. I've been battling an illness, so trying to get this show out when the voice sounded as good as it can. You can still definitely hear it there, but I took a day off. The Zags had a full week off to clear their heads heading into this game on Saturday evening at the Chiles Center against the Portland Pilots. We're going to talk about this Portland team. We're going to talk about what we want to see from Gonzaga after a week off, adjustments we hope that they have made, some potential things we want to see specifically in this game against the Pilots ahead of their game on Tuesday, a rematch against the Oregon State Beavers. Plus, we close out the show talking about this Gonzaga women's team as they host Pepperdine on Saturday, as well as some rumors about Courtney Vandersloot potentially going back home to play for the Chicago Sky, who drafted her way back in 2011. Talk about that to close out the show, but we'll start getting you ready for Saturday's tilt at the Chiles Center against the Portland Pilots, January 25th, 6 p.m. Pacific time. The game will be on ESPN Plus. As they have been. These games will also be on Fox 13 Plus in Seattle KHQ for those of you in the Spokane area. And according to Stephen Carr, a recent update, Montana has had issues watching the games. It sounds like it's been blacked out in Montana on ESPN Plus. That has been resolved. So if you are a Montana listener to Locked On Zags, it sounds like you should be able to watch the games going forward on ESPN Plus. Obviously, unfortunate that has been an issue throughout the season, but hopefully will be rectified for the final 6 weeks or so of the regular season. This is Gonzaga's first repeat opponent in the West Coast Conference. They played Portland back at the Spokane Arena earlier this month. I think it was like January 4th was the date of that game, or January 2nd. The Zags rolled to a victory over a hapless Portland team. 81-50 was the final score in that one. The Zags shot a blistering hot 11 of 24 from three, about just under 46%. A very balanced scoring effort in that game. Hickman led the team with 13. Dusty Stromer had 12 coming off the bench. The trio of Ryan Nembhard, Khalif Battle, and Braden Huff all had 10. Graham Ike had 9. It was a very balanced scoring effort against, again, a struggling Portland team that only shot 33% from the field in that one and was just 4 of 25 from three. That's down to 16%. Won't spend a ton of time meeting the Pilots since we already did that prior to their game back in the beginning of this month, and things haven't really changed for Portland. They're 7-14 overall on the year, down to 2-6 in conference play. They've gone 2-3 in 5 games since Gonzaga beat them at the arena earlier this month. They lost at home to St. Mary's. I was at that game. It was a pretty similar game to Gonzaga's game. Portland hung with St. Mary's for a little longer than I think we would have expected them to, but then St. Mary's rolled in the second half, ended up winning 81-58, so a very similar score to how Gonzaga beat Portland as well. Portland also lost to San Francisco, albeit in a much closer game. They also gave up 81 points in that game, 3 straight games, giving up exactly 81 points, but they scored 50 against Gonzaga, 58 against St. Mary's, and 72 against San Francisco to only take a 9-point loss there. And then they beat Pacific in overtime, 84-81. A nice win for Shantay Leggins and the Pilots. They lost at Washington State in Pullman, 92-70. And then their most recent game, they beat San Diego, the Toreros, at home, 92-82 in that one. It's wild how many games they've given up, either exactly 81 points or 82 in the case of that game against San Diego. So 2-3 on the season in the West Coast Conference for Shantay Leggins and the Pilots. Ken Pom not liking this team whatsoever. Doesn't help that their win. San Diego and Pacific, not exactly the best teams in the West Coast Conference. The Pilots now down to 309th at Ken Pom. We've talked about it many times on this podcast. The WCC is stronger. Oregon State and Washington State have been positive additions for this conference. but it gets very dragged down by the bottom teams in the league. Portland, chief among the culprits here, being a team outside the top 300 at KenPom. Not particularly good on either end of the floor. Offense is 251st. Defense, wow, 329th, one of just about the 30 worst defenses in the entire country. Tempo, they're 127th. They like to get up and down the floor when they can, but struggle to do so just from a personnel perspective and against teams that prevent them from getting out in transition. It can kind of stagnate their offense in a pretty major way. Team averages about 72 points per game. They shoot just over 43% from the field and about 34% from three. They do average about 14 turnovers per game, one of their big issues for this team. But as noted in their KenPom data, their biggest issues come on the defensive end of the floor, particularly an egregious attempts to defend the three-point line. They are allowing opponents to shoot 38% from three. That marker, according to KenPom, 350th in the country. That legitimately means there are only about 12 or 13 teams in the country worse at defending the three-point line than the Pilots of Portland. That one of many reasons that this should be a get-right opportunity for Mark Few and the Gonzaga Bulldogs. Yes, it is a road game. Typically, you look for those get-right games to happen at home, but over the course of pretty much the entire time that Gonzaga has been in the West Coast Conference, Portland has been a home away from home for the Zags at the Chiles Center. There's going to be a lot of Gonzaga fans in the house, chief among them myself. I will be there, looking forward to going to that game, assuming my health holds up and I'm able to make it. That's going to be a fun game. Love going to the Chiles Center. Love seeing the Zags fans that come out for that one. So expecting it to be a very pro-Zag crowd. In fact, KenPom does do data collecting home court advantage, and Portland is near the bottom of all Division I teams in terms of their overall home floor advantage. It's going to be even worse in this game against the Zags. So I expect it to be a pro-Gonzaga crowd, it to feel like a pseudo-home environment for Mark Few's club with a week off. There's a lot of things going well for Gonzaga. And in this game as well, Gonzaga hosts Oregon State just a few days later. They host them in Spokane on Tuesday. So they're only going to have 2 full days off after this game. Then they get St. Mary's next Saturday, February 1st. The Gales 7-0 in conference play, blasted San Francisco on Thursday, 71-51 over the Dons, who were in sole possession of second place in the WCC. Now Santa Clara is in second place. St. Mary's 2-game lead over everybody. Really comfortable spot for the Gales to be. So for Gonzaga, one thing we want to make sure they don't do, and we'll talk more in the second segment, but you can't look ahead. You still got to make sure you get this game taken care of. Beat Portland, ideally beat them bad enough that in the last 10 minutes of the game, you don't have to play the starters. You can get a lot of run from some of the backups. You can get those guys some rest so that they're not so that they are at 100% going into that game on Tuesday, when you really got to get a W against Oregon State, and you certainly can't look ahead of the Beavers before that game against St. Mary's. So 2 tough ones coming up for Gonzaga. This game is the opportunity to kind of use what they've worked on over the last week, clear their head from those 2 disastrous losses last week, get yourselves ready, get yourself a comfortable W, and get yourself fully prepared and carrying a little momentum into that game at home against Wayne Tinkle and the Beavers. So what does that specifically look like? What do we want to see Gonzaga do, not do differently on Saturday in Portland? We're going to talk about that coming up in just a second. But first, folks, attending NFL playoff games is an experience unlike any other, and this year Gametime makes it even easier to create those unforgettable moments with their new feature, Gametime Picks. It filters out the fluff and shows you only the best deals on great seats so you can focus on what matters, being there. I used Gametime Picks to grab tickets a few weeks ago for Purdue at Oregon, had an absolute blast with my dad, and it could not have been an easier process. I found a super deal that gave me incredible value for amazing seats. I could preview the view from my spot before buying, and the all-in pricing, folks, it's a game changer. There's no surprise fees at checkout. And I knew that my tickets are backed by the Gametime guarantee, so I could give those tickets to my dad for Christmas, knowing full well we were going to make it to that game or at least get our money back. So, folks, take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app now, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCollege, and you'll get $20 off your first purchase. Again, create an account, redeem code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off. Terms apply. Download Gametime today. Last-minute tickets, lowest prices, guaranteed. All right, folks, segment 2, still Andy Patton, still Locked On Zags podcast. Still getting you ready for Saturday's game against the Pilots of Portland in the Chiles Center in Portland. Going to be a fun game. Zags beat this team by 31 last time they faced them. So ideally not a game where Gonzaga is struggling, where we're not stressed down the stretch of this game. But what I really want to focus on here is not as much the keys to a victory for Gonzaga, although we'll talk about that a little bit, but things that I'll be looking for. The Zags had a full week off after giving up 200 points combined to Oregon State and Santa Clara. After giving up what seemed like 1 billion three-pointers to Santa Clara, it was actually 18, which is still a crap load against the Zags, giving up 100 points at the kennel for the first time ever. This team needed to make adjustments. They needed to clear their head. Braden Huff acknowledged that it was embarrassing, that it's not Gonzaga basketball what happened on Saturday. He's right. And those are the correct ways to feel. You should be mad. You should be embarrassed. You should be frustrated after a performance like that. But you also can't let it linger. You got to get rid of it. You got to find a way to make the adjustments, to do things differently going forward, while also not letting it impact how you play. Gonzaga was in a good spot where they had this whole week off to kind of get rid of that game, move on, figure out what you want to do differently, and proceed from there. So what are we going to be looking for on Saturday against these Pilots? Number one, we talked about it in kind of the Tuesday episode after the loss to Santa Clara, is are we going to see Gonzaga make specific lineup or rotation adjustments? We also want to see them make specific adjustments to what the actual actions that they're running, particularly defensively. We'll talk about that in a second. But what I want to talk about here is specific changes to the lineup. And again, this game, because of the quality of opponent, because of the game coming up on Tuesday, we may see some things differently later in the game. If Gonzaga's got a 20-plus point lead and we see a lot of Emmanuel Innocente or Jun Suk-Yo or, Ismail Adiani if he's healthy, like that doesn't necessarily mean that much. We'd like to see that, but it doesn't necessarily prove that Gonzaga's making any changes. So we're looking for lineup and rotation adjustments early in this game. A starting lineup change, perhaps, or an early substitution change, or at the end of the first half, if the minutes distribution is different, if some of the lineups on the floor are unique to what we've been seeing throughout the season. That's what we're going to be looking for. Namely, do we see more from Dusty Stromer? Stromer's been a little inconsistent offensively lately. He's struggled to shoot the ball. I think he's 4 of his last 18 or maybe 4 of his last 22 from 3, but he's a very good defensive player. He's good at navigating screens. He's a good on-ball defender. He is somebody who, if you want to improve defensively, he needs more minutes. Evan Miyakawa's data, a fantastic resource for college basketball fans, indicates that Gonzaga's best lineups involve him being on the floor. Do we see more of him? Do we see more of Emmanuel Innocente? Again, if it's the last 8 minutes of a game, Gonzaga's up 20, that doesn't necessarily mean anything. But if he's playing more in the first half, if he's playing more early in the second half, if this game is close for some reason and he's playing, that is a strong indication that he has earned more playing time in this lineup because of what he is able to do defensively for this club. Do we see more of Michael Ajayi? Yes, Michael Ajayi has overwhelmingly been a disappointment this season, but he is a good defensive player. Does he play more? Does he play out of position? They try to play him at the 3, something we discussed as a potential option. This might be a game to try that. You don't want to bench Ben Gregg, who is A, a good defensive player, B, a good offensive player, C, playing in his hometown of Portland. So you don't want to spend a lot of time with Ben on the bench, but I think more of Ajayi defensively is a good thing. This is the kind of game where maybe you can experiment with trying some of those different lineups with those players. Do we potentially see, does that playing time come at the expense of Braden Huff? Does it come at the expense of Nolan Hickman or even Khalif Battle? Those are the things we'll be watching for on Saturday. Key number 2, similar vein. Does Gonzaga try different approaches on defense? Do we see a zone? UP is a bad 3-point shooting team. I don't think you need to run zone against this team. You can handle them in a man-to-man defense, but it's important for Gonzaga to be able to play a zone because sometimes they just need to change things up. This team is too predictable defensively. Look at what Wayne Tinkle and Oregon State did against Gonzaga when they switched. They were playing a zone, then they were playing a man, then they were playing a 3-2 zone, and they were alternating between those defenses seemingly on a play-by-play basis in the first half against Gonzaga. Gonzaga actually navigated that fairly well, but it was a strategy that caused Gonzaga to have to not get as comfortable in their half-court sets, caused them to have to shoot later in the shot clock because they were adjusting. We saw Kentucky do this with Mark Pope as well. Gonzaga does not have the ability to do this because they don't play zone consistently enough. Do we see more of that in this game? some 2-3 zone, maybe even a 3-2 zone, which hasn't really been in the bag for Mark Few and the staff very often? Do we see more half-court traps? Something we see after made free throws fairly regularly, but again, it's predictable. You kind of know that that's coming. With this being their first repeat opponent of the year, it might be a good opportunity to try some new things, do things that Coach Leggins didn't see last time out, whether that's a full court press, whether that's more the half court trap in different situations, whether that's a zone, box and one, whatever defense you want to do. That's usually in response to somebody going off on you, but some kind of difference. Even if it's the man defense, but you're doing it a little differently, you're playing it a bit more aggressively. I don't think we'll ever see Gonzaga go away from hedging those screens. That's just been a part of their system for 25 years. It would be a crazy thing to change in 1 week, but something different from this team defensively, because if you're too predictable on that end, especially with personnel that's frankly not great defensively, being predictable, not having the great personnel, recipe for problems for this team defensively. Again, don't think it'll be a big issue against the Pilots, but you have to be ready to use that stuff later in the year, and this is a good game to get it out. Key number 3, something that has been a huge issue for Gonzaga all year long. Can they get out to a fast start in each half? You had a week off. You're in a relatively quiet road environment. Again, it'll hopefully be a pro Gonzaga crowd, but it's not going to be as loud as the Kennel. So you're in a relatively quiet environment. It's been a full week off. You're playing a team you already beat by 31 earlier this year. There's a lot of things that mix into a recipe where you could see a slow start for Gonzaga. This is not a good game for that. Coming out slow after losing the last 2 games is just, it's really draining. It's exhausting. It's frustrating. It makes them feel a little panicked. It makes the fans frustrated. You got to come out hot. Put this team on skates immediately. Make a few good defensive plays, knock down a couple open shots, build a big lead, force Shante Leggins to call a timeout before the first media timeout, and really establish yourself in this game. And then get out to a rocket fast start in the second half. No reason to let UP claw back into this game in the second half. Prove that you can do it. Because outside of a strong second half against Washington State, this team hasn't really proven it this year. No excuse to not have a strong second half against the Portland Pilots and a strong start to that game on Saturday. Key number 4, this is more of a key to a victory, but it is something we just want to see from this team in general. Knock down the outside shots. Most of Gonzaga's issues are defensively. We know that. This team does have lulls on offense. And frankly, when you play such poor defense, having a 4-minute lull on offense or a 6-minute lull on offense is often the difference between a win and a loss. We saw it against Oregon State. We saw it against Kentucky. We saw it against UConn is probably the most notable example. One of the main things for Gonzaga is being consistent as a 3-point shooting team. UP's horrible at defending it. They're horrible at defending it. Gonzaga shot 46% from 3 last time out. This team gives up 38% on average. Gonzaga made 18 threes against Shante Leggins earlier in his career. I think it was 2 years ago. This is a team that always lights it up against Portland because Portland's not good at defending the 3-point line. But you don't want to be too reliant on it either. This Portland team's not going to be able to defend Graham Ike and Braden Huff on the block. No reason to settle for threes when you can get those guys the rock in positions that are easier to score. Would like to see Nolan Hickman continue to shoot well from 3. He's been great, especially the last few games. Would like to see Dusty Stromer find his outside shot. That would be great. Would love to see Ben Gregg knock a few down. Ryan Nembhard knock a few down. But I also don't want to see Khalif Battle shooting a lot of threes. He doesn't need to. He shouldn't. He wants to, but he shouldn't. I would love to see Khalif Battle have more 2-point attempts and more free throw attempts than 3-point attempts in this game. Now, obviously, if Portland plays a super packed in zone and the offense is dictating that you take open threes, fine. Their context matters here. But if Khalif Battle is getting the ball in positions where he has the choice to either attack off the dribble, come off of a screen, or take a step back 3 or just an open 3, and he's consistently settling for threes instead of getting to the rim, that to me is a problem. And as I've said on the show the last week, it is at this point, it is a Mark Few issue for one of 2 reasons. Either he is consistently telling Khalif to shoot threes and encouraging him to be more of a 3-point shooter than a rim attacker, which is a bad decision by the coaching staff, or he is encouraging Khalif to be more aggressive going to the rim, doing what he was so successful at Temple and at Arkansas last year, and Khalif is not listening to him, is not making those adjustments, in which case it is still a coaching issue. It's also a Khalif Battle issue. That's what we saw against Santa Clara. He got benched, didn't play most, if not all. I'm not sure if he played at all in the second half of that game because he was not doing what the Zags wanted him to do. That was the impression that I got. How does he respond from that? Does he come out in this game and shoot a bunch of threes when he had opportunities to drive to the rim? If so, does Mark Few allow him to do that, or does he bench him? Do we see more of Dusty Stromer because of that? That's a huge part of this game, is how Khalif Battle responds and what types of shots he's taking in this game. And then key number 5 is to build a big lead so nobody plays more than 30 minutes. Again, we kind of already talked about this. No reason for Gonzaga to be in a close game here, and no reason for Gonzaga to not give some guys some rest with only 2 days off before a very important game on Tuesday at home against Wayne Tinkle and the Oregon State Beavers. Would love to see less of Nemhard, would love to see less of EK, would love to see everybody playing 25-ish minutes in this one. Would love to see 10-plus minutes from Emmanuel Innocente. Again, whether that comes in the first half or second half does matter in terms of evaluating what changes Mark Few may have made over the last week. Would love to see Junsu Kyo. Would love to see Ismaila Diani if he's healthy. Would love to see the walk-ons, depending which ones travel for this game. I think there's a lot of opportunities for Gonzaga to get a big lead, to play everybody 30 or less minutes in this one, and to get some guys some rest so that they are at 100% for that game on Tuesday against Oregon State. Folks, moving on from talking about this Gonzaga game coming up against Portland, talk about the women's team who is facing Pepperdine and Malibu on Saturday, looking to make 7 straight wins. We're going to talk about that and the latest rumors on Courtney Vandersloot coming up in just a second. All right, folks, segment 3, still Andy Patton, still Locked On Zags podcast, moving away from getting you prepped for Gonzaga's game on Saturday against Portland at the Chiles Center to instead talk about the women's team who's going on the road, also to take on a team they've already played this year, the Waves of Pepperdine. That game on Saturday at 1 p.m. Pacific time. It will also be on ESPN+. The Zags beat Pepperdine back at the Kennel. 75-54 was the final score there back on December 30th. Yvonne Ejim had 23 points, 8 rebounds. She shot 9 of 15 from the field. Claire O'Connor nearly had a double-double in that one, 11 points, 9 boards. She was a perfect 3 of 3 on her 2-point attempts. Inez Betancourt came off the bench in that one, 14 points for her, as well as 3 steals, 2 assists. She was 5 of 8 from the field and 2 of 5 from 3. Pepperdine struggling this season. They're 7-10 on the year, including just 2-6 in the WCC. Their only 2 wins are against San Diego. They had games against Portland and LMU that were both postponed due to the wildfires. We saw that with Pepperdine's schedule on the men's side and on the women's side. They've had some sporting events canceled, postponed, because they needed to be evacuated. They needed to use their facilities for other things. So we'll see if they end up getting those games back on the schedule, but it's not expected, of course, to impact Gonzaga's game this Saturday. Pepperdine averaging just 60 points per game. They're only shooting 39% from the field and 29% from 3. Not a particularly great offensive team, not a great defensive team either. Really struggling this season. Ella Brubaker's their star, 11 points, 3.5 boards, and just over 1 steal per game. Chloe Sotel also 10.5 points, 3 assists, and about 3 rebounds per game. This team averages about 12 assists per game, but over 15 turnovers per game. Gonzaga, again, beat them by 21 last time out, should comfortably win this one here, which would be their 7th consecutive win after starting the season with such a struggle with the 3 losses at the Paradise Jam in the Virgin Islands, with some other struggles in the non-conference slate. They've been playing a lot better once they've gotten into conference play. Hopefully that momentum will continue for this team. Yvonne Ejim in particular was the National Player of the Week last week after her 35-point, 13-board game against the Portland Pilots. Been phenomenal to see her play like the best player, the best mid-major player in college basketball. She won that award last year, the Becky Hammond Award for best mid-major player in the year. She's on the watch list to do so again this year. Very strong candidate to be back-to-back in that category. Allie Turner continues to be the best freshman in the conference, one of the best freshmen, frankly, in the entire country with how she has played this year. So it's been great to see the 2 of them really carry this team. But we've also seen great performances from Maud Hybens. We've seen great performances from Claire O'Connor. We mentioned she had a great game last time out in this one. We've seen Taylor Dalton and Breece Allen-Bien be crucial pieces coming off the bench for this team. So they've really kind of hit their stride and have an opportunity to continue to build that momentum with the win over the Waves on Saturday. Sticking with women's basketball to close out the show, the great Annie Costabile, who writes at the Chicago Sun-Times. She is a WNBA newsbreaker. She's really plugged into the league, covers the Sky predominantly. She reported that there was a meeting between free agent and former Gonzaga legend Courtney Vandersloot and the Chicago Sky. Courtney, of course, spent the majority of her professional career with the Sky. They drafted her 3rd overall back in 2011. She spent 12 years with the Sky, was a 4-time All-Star, 5 All-WNBA nominations. She's currently 2nd in WNBA history in assists, just behind the great Sue Bird. And she helped bring the Sky their first WNBA championship in 2022 before she moved on as a free agent, signed with the New York Liberty. Also won a championship with the Liberty, playing alongside the great Sabrina Ionescu, who was also coached by Kelly Graves, her at the University of Oregon. Breanna Stewart is with that New York Liberty team. John Cal Jones. It's a phenomenal roster. Courtney two WNBA championships now at the latter part of her career, but she's a free agent now. She's coming off a rough year last year. She still was a starter for New York. She still played. Her minutes dropped a little bit and her performance dropped. She was dealing with a tragic loss. Her mother passed away at the start of the season. So I think there's a lot of kind of expectation that was impacting her mentally throughout the year. She's now playing in part of the Unrivaled Basketball League, which is a 3-on-3 tournament started by Breanna Stewart to help kind of have a place for some of these star women's basketball players to play, as opposed to going overseas. The WNBA season goes through the summer. So most players end up going overseas to play professional basketball in Europe or somewhere else before coming back to the States to play the WNBA season. Now Sloot and many others are playing in this Unrivaled League, games taking place in Las Vegas. While she navigates free agency, looking for where she wants to end up, it's possible she has a reunion with Chicago, again, the team that she played the majority of her career with, the team that she met her future wife, now current wife, Allie Quigley, who's been retired for the last year, was a part of that championship team alongside Candace Parker for the Chicago Sky. So certainly something to monitor. Courtney could be returning home to play for the Sky. Probably got a couple of years left, depending on how long she wants to play, depending on course of her staying healthy. Last year, not having a great year, kind of slowed the momentum for her to potentially pass Sue Bird and become the WNBA's all-time assist leader. Doesn't mean it won't happen. It still very much could. She's just got a little bit more of a ways to go to get there than she would have if she'd had a season similar to her previous seasons last year. But still very fun to monitor this. Will be exciting to see if she does end up going back to the Sky, if she returns to New York, if she looks at potentially coming over to the Seattle Storm and playing closer to her hometown where she grew up just outside of Seattle. I'm excited to see if next year, when the Portland WNBA franchise comes along, if Courtney could be somebody that gets targeted by them if she does not get protected by whichever WNBA team she's on at the end of this year. So certainly some fun things to monitor with Courtney as she comes towards the end of her WNBA career, but we don't want to sunset her yet. She's still got some time left on the clock, hopefully a rebound from last year's tough season in New York. It's going to wrap it up for me today here on the Locked On Zags podcast. Folks, thank you so much for making the show your first listen or your first watch of the day. Come say hi if you see me at the Portland game on Saturday. Going to be a fun one there. We'll be back next week, recapping that game, getting you ready for that game against Oregon State, and then, of course, getting you ready for the big one on Saturday, February 1st against Randy Bennett and the Gales. Thanks again, folks. Have a fantastic day and weekend, and as always, go Zags.